In today's changing world, every teacher deserves a STEM ally. Project Lead the Way is a proven national leader in science, technology, engineering, and math education for pre-K through high school. They strive to help teachers make every student in every grade STEM successful through interactive problem-based learning. Learn more and find a school with Project Lead the Way near you at pltw.org.
In 2002, Canadian Thomas Homer Dixon published The Ingenuity Gap, where he noted that we had crossed an important threshold in human history where the collective problems that we face have outstripped our collective problem solving. That call to action really lit a fire under me and made me an advocate for entrepreneurship and collective problem solving. Our guest today, Zoe Weil, has proposed a solution to this ingenuity gap. She calls it the Solutionary Way. I'm Tom Vander Ark. You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast, and today we're joined by a favorite, a repeat guest, Zoe Weil. She's the president of the Institute for Humane Education. I think this is her seventh book, The Solutionary Way. Zoe, it's so great to have you back.
It's great to be back, Tom. Thank you for having me.
So your last book aimed a bit more specifically at education. It was called The World Becomes What We Teach, Educating a Generation of Solutionaries. We love that book, believe it's still a super important guidebook for, we think particularly for secondary schools, but also colleges. I'm curious, did you see schools using that book, taking it up post-pandemic? What's the reception been?
The reception's been great, and the book actually became a #1 Amazon release in the philosophy and social aspects of education. So it's gained a lot of attention from educators, which is what we wanted. And it's being used in a lot of states, and we're excited about how it's being used. So, like in several counties in California, for example, they are using that book with their teachers as a foundational book for bringing the solutionary framework to students. And that framework, we are now training teachers all over the world to use. So that book is foundational for our work in K-12 schools, and we're in 26 countries. We're all across the US. We are really doing this work very deeply in our home state of Maine, where by the end of this year, we will have trained 300 teachers in the solutionary framework, and they in turn are bringing this to every county in Maine. So it's happening all over, and the book is really the vision and the blueprint for people who want to use it. But many people find a book is not enough, and so then we provide the additional training and coaching and facilitation through our solutionary micro credential course that we offer to teachers.
I love that. With Antioch, right?
Antioch is the institution with whom we have partnered for our graduate programs. So Antioch University is our partner for our graduate programs for our solutionary micro-credential course, where we are providing an online course for teachers. That's happening through the Institute for Humane Education. And for those who are interested, our website is humane.org.
Joe, one thing I deeply appreciate about your book, The World Becomes What We Teach, your previous book, is that you were writing that at the same time that I was working on difference making at the heart of learning. And the two books are very similar in that they encourage schools to put this idea of solutioning, of finding problems worth solving and taking them on collectively as a really big idea. I feel like we've been on parallel paths for the last 20 years and advocating more schools to adopt this as as really the backbone, as the new mission for education. And let's talk about your new book, The Solutionary Way. I was surprised when I read it. I guess I assumed that you'd go back to the education audience. But this one is really a bit more of a general audience piece. You're really trying to convince the other 8 billion people on the planet that they need to become solutionaries. Why take on the world?
Because I have a very big goal, which is to work toward a future where all people, animals, and nature can thrive. So that's a really big goal. The animals don't have to work on the solutions, but we have to make sure that our solutions don't harm them. And one of the things that we see when we do this work with students is that it's great for them, it's great for their schools and communities, and it contributes to a better world. It's such a win. And it's also really important that we not leave this to the next generation
Yeah.
to solve the problems that we face. Some of them are potentially catastrophic in a very short time frame. And so we need everybody to become a solutionary. And when we've seen the response from young people, which has been just phenomenally positive, they love this education. I thought we have to provide this for everybody. So literally everybody can learn to be a solutionary. When I wrote the book, I was also hoping that people who are entrepreneurs, people who are in politics, are elected officials, people who are in the legal system, the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, people who are in energy and building and production and food systems will become solutionaries, because we need all of those systems to become more sustainable and more just and more humane. So that's why I wrote the book, because we can't wait for the next generation. We all have to be on board.
So in the preface, you say a solutionary is someone who identifies and solves systemic problems in ways that do the most good and the least harm. Both parts of that definition are important to you. Someone who identifies and solves systematic problems in ways that do the most harm, the most good and the least harm. In chapter 2, you talk about this MOGO principle, most good, least harm. So I love that. And it's also interesting, Zoe, that before I was a public school superintendent, I spent a decade teaching in a business school. And so I have sort of an ROI brain and think about return on investment. And when I think about problem solving, I think about entrepreneurship and tend to think about enterprise creation and return on investment. This MOGO, most good, least harm, is really a beautiful and an appropriate and an extensible framework for a broad set of problems. Where'd that come from? What's the backstory on MOGO?
So my goal in life has always been to help create a world that is better for everyone. And I have never been able to narrow everyone down. So some people are focused on humans and they might be focused on one group of humans. Some people are focused on animals and maybe one group of animals, like pets, but not animals who are used for food. And some people on environmental issues. And I've just never been able to compartmentalize that way. To me, to create a world where everyone can flourish should be all of our goals. It doesn't mean that some people don't narrow down their focus. Makes sense to narrow down your focus. But so that ethical foundation lies at the root of the word solutionary. So you might ask, like, why do we need a new word, solutionary? How is a solutionary different from a problem solver? But a problem solver could solve the problem of damming a river or the problem of blowing up a mountain for coal removal, but they don't have that ethical foundation of doing the most good and the least harm to everyone. So that's why we need this word, solutionary. And a solutionary is also not synonymous with humanitarian. So lots of people are striving to relieve suffering and try to mitigate harm. But solutionaries are looking for those root and systemic causes so that the problems do not persist. So for those reasons, solutionary has this definition of looking at systems and addressing them, and also striving to do so with this principle of doing the most good in the
Yeah.
least.
It reminds me a bit of effective altruism. Are there things about that, about Peter Singer's work that were foundational to this idea?
So Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, which I read in the early 1980s, was transformational book for me. That's what really introduced me to the harm we were causing to non-human animals. And so I've always been aligned with Peter's vision for creating a world that is humane toward animals. And Peter has a bigger vision of also creating a world that really does the most good and the least harm. And in fact, Peter wrote a testimonial for my book titled Most Good, Least Harm many years ago. And so there is that alignment. And so effective altruism is seeking like the most effective and strategic ways to create change. And embedded in the solutionary framework is looking for those levers that are going to have the most strategic positive effects. So there is an overlap there.
So the older I get, the more I become aware of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but my sleepless nights are plagued by thoughts about the unintended consequences of things that I helped initiate 10, 20, even 30 years ago. So I love that you brought that into the book. But these are, as the name suggests, they're unintended. They can be difficult to spot. How do we better take into account the unexpected? Maybe that's number one. And number two, the most good over a long time frame, taking an ancestor's point of view. Are both of those included?
It's a great question. So, the solutionary framework itself, the process that I articulate in chapter 5 of the book, there's 4 phases to it. The first is to identify the problem that you want to solve. And that might sound really simple, but in fact, you could have a problem that you think is a terrible problem, and then you go research and you realize, you know what? It's actually that's not the problem. This is the problem. And so that first phase is learning enough to identify the problem you want to solve, and also identifying a problem that is feasible for you to solve, that is within your sphere of influence. So you might be concerned about climate change. And if you're going to be a solutionary, you're probably not going to write a problem statement that is going to address climate change, but you might address it in, again, your sphere of influence, locally, where you can make a difference. The next phase is going to be to investigate thoroughly. And that investigation problem should be thorough enough that you will be able, when you get to the next phase, to spot potential unintended negative consequences. You're going to not only research online, you're going to reach out to stakeholders. You're going to talk to people who have tried to solve this problem in the past. You're going to see what's worked and what's failed. You're going to reach out to a range of stakeholders, including the beneficiaries of the systems that perpetuate this problem. So you're going to have a lot of knowledge before you step into phase 3, which is to innovate your solution. And it's possible that you're not going to come up with a brand new solution, but you're going to look at where solutions are taking root elsewhere, and you might bring them into your context. Or you might find somebody who's come up with a great solution because they're a great innovator, but they're not very good at sharing or scaling. And you might take their idea and run with their idea based on what your skill set is. And you're going to be asking yourself in that process, how solutionary is this solution? In other words, you're going to constantly ask yourself, is it addressing the root and or systemic causes of this problem? And is it doing it in a way that does the most good and the least harm? So by asking enough questions, you're going to get at least closer to reducing the chance of having any serious unintended negative consequences. And then finally, in phase 4, you implement your solution. And you don't just stop, you don't just implement and then you're like done. You implement and you evaluate and then you iterate. So you are looking for potential problems. So it is a clear process. There is a framework for it. Each one of those phases has 3 steps. So if you go through it sequentially, the chances are you'll be successful. It's not a simple process, but it's a very clear process. And I think that if we all embark upon it, whatever the problem we may want to address, however small, we will become so accustomed to thinking like a solutionary that we will just over time be cognizant of where potential unintended negative consequences can happen.
In your new book, The Solutionary Way, you did a beautiful job of laying out the process, and thanks for covering that. I want to go back to the very beginning of identifying the problem. You call that step one in the process. I think this might be the most important new skill set and mindset that we can help teach in young people. It's not spoken about very often. So I want to spend a little bit of time here. I appreciate that you said work on an important problem. I think that means important to you and important to the world. And then you added an important step of noting that you have to work on the right problem to make sure that you're going to a root cause and that you're framing it in a way that a solution is possible. Do you see in schools that schools are beginning to adopt new portraits of a graduate? Do you see this idea of problem identification, problem finding, opportunity spotting? Is that starting to show up as a priority goal? If not, how do we better advocate for this as a new priority skill set?
Well, it's certainly happening wherever we're involved because it's such an integral part of the solutionary framework. So, whether it's happening on a larger scale outside of where we work, I don't know the answer to that. And that would be an interesting question to find the answer to. One of the things that I think is really interesting is, and I just heard about an example of this. So, there are problems that we hear about in our society all the time, right? They're the ones that the media may focus on or politicians may focus on. And there was one student who was looking at the problem of how immigrants were taking jobs away from local people in his community. And he embarked upon that problem because he'd obviously heard this was a problem. But as soon as he did research, to investigate it, it actually wasn't a problem. Immigrants in his community were not taking jobs from local people, but he had to do the research to find that out. So, in a sense, this process of identifying a problem, investigating it thoroughly, it can loop you right back to the beginning, right? You can identify a problem that you think is a problem, start investigating it, realize, oh, it's not a problem, or there's a different aspect of the problem. And then you come back and you rewrite your problem statement. Even though this process is linear in the sense that we start with phase one and we end with phase four, that word at the end, iterate, it's so iterative all along the way. And the exciting thing about this process is that it cultivates solutionary thinking. And solutionary thinking is comprised of many forms of thinking, but primarily critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking. And the thinking processes themselves, at least with students, are more important than the problems that they end up solving. If you have a sixth grader who's working on this, they may not solve some huge problem, but if they learn to think like a solutionary and then they go into seventh grade and eighth grade and high school and college and their career with this solutionary thinking deeply cultivated, that's the goal, right? The real goal is that as all of us get older and more proficient and follow our career paths and follow our volunteer paths, whatever we do, that we become vastly more successful at being solutionaries and that we look at issues that are presented to us in either or terms or black and white terms, and we say, what's the underlying problem here? How can we work together to solve it? And this kind of thinking is really an antidote to the polarization that we are experiencing in our society and that we certainly don't want to take over schools, and it's already influenced schools, the polarization and the divisiveness. And this solutionary framework is a corrective to that.
It seems to be. I want to come back to that. Let me just note, as we wrap up a review of the book, chapter 6 illustrates how this can be applied to many different kinds of problems. You illustrate solutions in food, population, economy, production, politics, criminal justice, biomedical research, as well as education. So this is a robust and broadly applicable, structured problem-solving approach, right?
Yeah. And I didn't want to leave people who read the book with just the theory behind it and the practice of it. I wanted to give examples. So, chapter 6 is solutions. Now, I am not claiming that none of these solutions is in depth. Every one of those systems that you just named would be its own multi-volume series of books about how we solve those problems. But it gives some examples so that people will read the book and be able to see where they fit in. So there's 3 questions that I always encourage people to ask themselves who want to go on this solutionary way. The first question is, what problems concern me? What are the issues that I care about? The next is, what am I good at? And the third is, what do I love to do? And we're not going to know all the things that we're good at. We're not going to know all the things that we love to do, but we know some of them. And if we can apply them to what we care about, then we're on the path toward being able to sustain this effort and make a positive difference.
All right, so I want to make two proposals here. One is I've long advocated that every school and every school system should have a common structured problem-solving approach. We like the design thinking approach that the Stanford D School piloted more than 20 years ago. Some folks like Digital Promise advocate for a computational thinking framework. South Fayette near Pittsburgh is a great example of a school district that has K-12 computational thinking as a common structured problem-solving approach. But your framework is so robust and so extensible, I'm proposing that every school adopt the solutionary framework as the common problem-solving approach across the curriculum.
Tom, from your mouth to the world's ears.
And the second proposal is I think every freshman should have a solutionary class. There's one of our favorite schools in Kansas City is Lead Innovation Studios, and every freshman gets a leadership and design class that I think builds the personal and problem-solving skills and habits that really equips them for that inquiry-based four-year curriculum. Design Tech High in California, similar freshman class that focuses on prototyping, but expressing your ideas and then iterating on those. These are two examples of schools that have put right at the beginning of the high school experience, personal leadership and design skills. And I think this book, The Solutionary Way, ought to be the textbook for a freshman class. And then schools ought to adopt the approach across the curriculum. And then we should have a solutionary capstone where kids really get to demonstrate value creation for their community. How does that sound to you?
That sounds great. And then I would add to it that this solutionary process be incorporated into other classes.
Right.
So we had this.
Absolutely. Across the curriculum. It should be how we teach science.
Absolutely. Yes.
It's obviously how we should teach social studies.
Yeah. And, a number of years ago, 6 years ago, we were piloting a solutionary program in a number of schools in the state of Maine. And those kids who were in that pilot are now seniors in high school. And we went back this year and we interviewed them. And it was amazing how many of them talked about how transformational that unit they did, it was just a unit that they did in 6th grade was. What was really interesting is one of them expressed being really frustrated and angry that they'd never had it again, that they had this incredible opportunity in sixth grade that they all remembered, that all had so much meaning for them, and then it was gone. And it shouldn't be gone. It should be integrated throughout. And I would say, let's not only make it freshmen in high school, let's make it freshmen in college.
I love it. It's really a spiral, just like you said. You should keep building these skills. About the time this podcast comes out, we'll be celebrating with the 85 high schools in the Kansas City area their success in real-world learning. And the exciting thing about that, Joe, is that all of these schools have injected community-connected projects and entrepreneurial experiences into core classes, into elective classes, into career and technical classes. And so from 9th to 12th grade, many classes now have projects connected to the community where the goal is to create value for your community. And so it's exciting to know that there's pockets of this around the country where solutioning, where difference making is really starting to catch hold. And I think more and more people are going to catch on to this secret that these are super valuable experiences, super valuable growth experiences that build agency and identity and purpose and motivation unlike anything else. So they're super valuable academically, and they have the beautiful benefit of making the world a better place at the same time. Deeply appreciate your contribution. Any person or a couple of people that you want to give a shout out to that were instrumental in this latest sprint?
I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to Jane Goodall, who wrote the foreword to the book. And so that was an incredible honor. And our team at the Institute for Humane Education is amazing. And our executive director, he's also a former school superintendent, award-winning superintendent, Steve Cochran, and he has been leading us forward. Julie Meltzer is directing our K-12 and teacher education, and she's the reason we are in all of these countries and in all of these schools. And Mary Pat Champeau is the director of our online graduate programs with Antioch University. And everybody who meets Mary Pat is stunned by her incredible intelligence and wisdom and kindness. And so I work with this dream team that includes them, but also a host of other people at the organization. And honestly, when you work with amazing people on a truly great mission, it's just a joy. And that should be the take-home message for anybody who is listening to this. When you do solutionary work and you collaborate with other great people and you are doing what you love and what you're good at in service to what you care about, your life will be so enriched and so meaningful and purposeful. And that's a win all by itself. If for no other reason to go on this path, it's going to improve your own life.
That was a masterclass in career education in 2 minutes. Run, don't walk to your nearest bookstore and get The Solutionary Way. Transform your life, your community, and the world for the better. The 8th book by our guest today, Zoe Weil. So it's been such a treat. We really appreciate you and the Institute. Thanks for joining us again.
Likewise, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thanks to our producer, Mason Pasha, and the whole Getting Smart team for making this possible. Until next week, keep learning, keep leading, and keep solutioning. See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.